Hello, and welcome back to Decommissioned, the serialization podcast. Today, we turn our gaze to that most noble of concepts in the world of pharmaceutical serialization, the data standard, a thing designed to bring order, simplicity, and trust to the supply chain. The tragedy, however, is not in the standard, but in the theatre of its misapplication. We've seen vendors, sometimes even those who've helped draft the very standards themselves, opting for proprietary shortcuts, and worse, consultants who happily endorse these diversions. The standard is a compass. The trouble is, too many vendors and consultants insist on drawing their own maps. The result? Complexity where there should be clarity, floods of meaningless information where there should be reassurance, and costs piling high where there should have been efficiency. And it's worth remembering, this isn't about compliance. This is about digital transformation. Properly applied data standards should pave the way for automation, efficiency, and actionable insight across the pharmaceutical supply chain. Yet, when vendors distort those standards, we lose not just compliance, we lose the very benefits of digitization that the standards were designed to unlock. So what do we actually mean when we say data standards in serialization? Who defines them? Who enforces them? And crucially, for example in the US, where adherence is often a matter of interpretation, what might the industry look like if data standards had been followed as intended? And how does that compare with Europe, where enforcement has been far stricter or possibly more effective? To help us navigate this landscape, once again I'm joined by two colleagues of rare insight and expertise, Jerome Bertin and Scott Pugh. Gentlemen, welcome back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Yeah, great introduction. And I think obviously a really critical topic that we're going to be discussing today. So I think what's probably important to start with is to make sure we're putting some very specific definitions around what we mean when we say data standards, because I think that could mean a lot of different things to different people. And clearly within the serialization space, the concepts of standards apply everywhere from physical aspects, right? The barcodes themselves, how the data goes inside those barcodes, up through what we're going to really be focusing on today that we're calling data standards, which is really what drives interoperability of data between systems, right? Clearly, as we're all intimately aware, the concept of supply chain serialization and traceability inherently means that you're going to have to be able to share and exchange information across disparate systems, right? Different systems from different vendors of different types with different capabilities. So that's where the concept of standards is so critical, because at some level, we all have to make sure we're talking the same language in order for this to actually be achievable, right? And I think what we're going to be able to talk through in depth during the session today is where we've seen some challenges in the implementation of those standards, but also where we've seen some successes. And I think we're going to be able to show and sort of compare, contrast those challenges and successes, and really use those as examples to demonstrate, as you pointed out, Justin, how that impacts the ability to be compliant with various global regulations. But probably just as equally as important to our listeners, right, is how it impacts their bottom line. And I think that's really one of the key takeaways that we want to make sure is clear coming out of this session today, right, is the ability to correctly, and I would argue in a fairly strict way, adhere to data standards, interoperability standards, basically dictates not just your level of risk, but level of cost that you're going to incur by and large from your serialization capability and ongoing operations. So look forward to the discussion today. Jerome, not sure if you want to kind of start off with any intro top comments, and then we can dive into to some first points.
Yeah, I'd agree with you that data standards and the application of data standards is a really important topic, particularly when you're considering the data that needs to go, that either flow through the supply chain or flow through systems. If that's not consistent or not consistently applied, then there are going to be issues in all across the supply chain, and particularly bigger issues for manufacturers dealing with multiple exceptions, and the time and effort spent resolving those with other stakeholders in the supply chain. And then when we look at data standards, as you quite rightly said, are we talking about international standards, ISO standards, or are we talking about business standards or regulatory standards? I think we're talking about all of them, and it's making sure that we get the compliance correctly and the enforcement correctly within the supply chain means you can actually reduce the cost to business of operating serialization in the real world.
Yeah, so I think, let's maybe start to put some, again, more specific definition about what we want to focus on today. And so let's talk about what we're going to refer to as standards, but standards that are at, let's call it maybe two different levels. First and foremost, and I think probably the interoperability standard that most folks are probably familiar with and hopefully familiar with is the GS1 EPCIS standard, right? This is the standard, again, defined by GS1 organization, of course, GS1 being a global organization that then operates through, country-specific market organizations. GS1 is responsible for the EPCIS standard, which is essentially intended to be the way that serialization and maybe more specifically traceability data can be exchanged between two different software solutions or two different computer systems, right? So EPCIS data, traceability data being captured, let's say at a packaging facility, and that's describing the packaging, the aggregation, the shipping details of product as it goes through packaging operations, the way that packaging operation can communicate that traceability data, let's say up to a corporate traceability system, would be through the use of this EPCIS standard. So we're going to be saying and talking a lot about EPCIS during this session today, because again, it's one of the sort of foundational layers that has certainly helped to facilitate, right, traceability as we know it across global regulations. It's also, though, the area that we're going to make sure we focus on that's probably had the most challenges in terms of its implementation across the industry. So that's one of the key standards that we'll focus on. So the other key standard that we'll use as a good sort of compare-contrast point, again, at a little bit different level, but that's going to be the data integration standards defined by the EMVS organization, or the EMVO, in terms of how different actors within the supply chain need to interact with the EMVS or the EU hub system. So again, it's still a data standard because it's essentially the specifications for how I would communicate data to the EU hub system. It's the way that I would receive data back from the EU hub system. It's not defined by a global organization like GS1, but it is defined within the context of what's required for the FMD regulation specifically. And so again, I think it's sort of just a good comparison point to use in that case to show how certain data standards can be implemented, and probably most importantly, I think the point we'll touch on is how those data standards can be strictly enforced. Right, that's going to be a key thing that I think we keep coming back to today throughout this session.
Yeah, that's a really important point, especially when you think about the impact on your business operations, and as you say, your bottom line. These actions underpin compliance, yes, but there's a business at hand here, and what if compliance is actually being compromised? The data itself may seem the same, but it's the way it moves through the supply chain, and even transformations of the data in most cases isn't fully understood in terms of risk to the data integrity in the supply chain for the US and Europe.
I think it's important to point out that the European system, the EMVS, the data interchange within the supply chain is actually done within the EMVS hub system, hub and spoke system. So as the packs pass through the supply chain and the verification scans go on, all of that interchange is actually is standard, and audit trails are logged to make sure that traceability of a pack through the supply chain is built up within the system, not as it transfers between different partners.
Yeah, exactly. And I think so. Let's kind of really key in on that, on what I think is that critical point raised, right? Which is the ability to measure how effective a standard is being implemented within any particular context is really going to be driven by the ability for that standard to be enforced, right? And again, I keep coming back to that term enforcement because I think that's going to be really one of the key differences, if you will, between what we've seen evolve with the implementation of the EPCIS standard versus the sort of the evolution of the implementation of the EMVS data integration, specifications to the EU hub. Because there's a very clear and distinct difference, right? And to just drive directly to the point, if we're talking about the context of FMD and we're talking about the specifications defined for how you need to communicate, and let's just take the role of an MAH, right? How I need to communicate my serialization data to the EU hub, right? So every time I'm done with a batch, right, I need to communicate which serial numbers were printed and commissioned as part of that batch, right? I have to communicate that up to the EU hub. There are very strictly defined specifications for how I need to communicate that data to the hub. If I follow it, my data goes to the hub and ultimately kind of goes to where it needs to go from a EU perspective. If I don't follow it, right, and I know, Jerome, this is exactly what you can share more in depth on. If I don't follow those EMVS specifications, I simply am not uploading my data to the hub, which means, right, I'm not going to be compliant with FMD, right? So it's a very clear cut, right? I either am doing what I need to do or I'm not doing what I need to do, and that's very strictly based on these specifications, defined for integration to the EU hub.
Yeah, I think that's important. The data upload into the EU hub, if that data upload is not successful, not complete, the medicines actually can't be issued into the market, distributed in the market, unless the data's there. So that's one key piece of enforcement, and that's a real driver for companies. That if you have to explain to the regulator why your data is not in the market, they're always going to say, well, your products can't be in the market, so that impacts your sales, it impacts your revenue stream. So there is a sort of real motivator there with the system to make sure that the data that's uploaded is correct and goes into the system correctly, so that you can continue to distribute your packs within the market or markets and also receive the revenue from sales.
And so I think that's exactly and sort of the key contrast point, if you will, of what I would consider and say is a benefit, right, of the how FMD approached its, call it, data standard concepts, right, by being very explicit in defining these specifications and, most importantly, having a system that can strictly enforce that those data specifications are being followed. If we take that concept, right, which again I would consider to be a good example of where data standards are strictly enforced, now take that and compare it to how DSCSA operates in the US. So on the US side, obviously a very different model from a regulatory standpoint, because now we're talking about a track and trace model. We have no concept of a centralized system similar to the role that the EU hub or EMVS system plays, right? We have no concept of that in the US. So we are reliant upon data exchange happening directly between the trading partners as that product flows through the supply chain, which is perfectly fine, right? Because again, it's an entirely different model that the US is undertaking, right? A track and trace model. The challenge is, without having sort of that centralized system, or even what I would consider to be a decentralized yet still, sort of common agreement on how this data needs to be exchanged, what we're left with is basically many different people's interpretations of how to use, now back to the EPCIS standard, right? How to use that EPCIS standard to get my traceability data from my organization to my trading partner's organization, as well as even within my four walls, right? How to get the data from my packaging site operations and from my distribution operations So there's a much heavier emphasis, I think, if you will, naturally in a track and trace model on the data exchange aspect. And I think the challenge that the US has had is, even though we have largely, and I know we're going to talk about some specific instances where this is not true, but largely the US has rallied around the use of EPCIS as the, call it, de facto standard that should be used anytime serialization data should be exchanged. What has evolved from 10, 15 years ago till today is, when you look out in actual data exchanges happening today across the US supply chain, even though they might be labeled EPCIS, what you see is probably 5 to 10 plus different flavors. I always use the term flavors or varieties of EPCIS. Plus, you still have occurrences and instances where EPCIS is not being used at all, right? There are plenty of historical, not just historical, but present day, references, if you will, to where packaging site information, distribution site information is being gathered and exchanged within a manufacturer setting, not even leveraging EPCIS at all, right? But in fact, leveraging proprietary data standards. And I know one of the key points we want to focus on during the session today is to really drill into the significant risks and costs, right, that companies are undertaking when they're implementing these solutions, right, that don't strictly follow, or even follow at all, data standards like EPCIS across all of their data exchanges.
You know me, and that point about proprietary formats is critical. Anyone who works in this space knows exactly who I'm referring to. It still amazes me that TLXML, a proprietary schema, is often viewed as a viable option for US operations when the regulation itself specifies EPCIS. For me, it's a red flag. TLXML relies on translation layers that convert data into and out of EPCIS. And each translation adds the possibility of mapping inconsistencies, latency, and data drift. And that's basically the technical cause and effect we've observed firsthand. And a native EPCIS implementation is simpler, it's cleaner, it's more reliable, especially for level 4 and level 5. Even level 3, for that matter, it's just a more robust and reliable interoperable language to be using. I mean, if the industry has agreed to communicate in English, the shared language of EPCIS, let's say, then any intermediary dialect introduces friction, right? What's more interesting is the contributors to the EPCIS guidelines use TLXML natively, which is bonkers. It inevitably transforms the data and changes its integrity characteristics. Any extra mapping work it has to be undertaken. There's additional latency and obviously more cost and resource, right? We've seen businesses paid to maintain translation layers that just wouldn't be necessary in a native EPCIS environment. So, I mean, the industry is maturing and vendor reliance is natural, but it's worth questioning whether proprietary architecture really serves efficiency or just simply complicates it by maintaining translation layers that shouldn't even exist in the first place.
So I'll ask you some leading questions here, Justin, right? And because I do think it's important to maybe give some context around how the use of EPCIS evolved across the industry. Because I think to the points you're highlighting, right, there are considerations, absolutely, and we'll discuss this even further, right? There's considerations clearly on the solution provider or vendor side of things, but then there's also a responsibility, if you will, from the industry side as well, right? So if we think through the context, as I go back to the introduction, some of the comments I made at the very start, right? Supply chain traceability inherently requires the exchange of data between systems from different vendors of all different, shapes, sizes, capabilities, features, you name it, right? These are vastly different systems in some cases that have to be responsible for making sure that they can both send and receive data in a efficient and robust manner, right? These are systems that can't constantly be failing, even if we happen to see that quite often. And so when you think of this concept, right, when we're trying to build capabilities that have to inherently go across a supply chain, you would assume that clearly all agreeing and aligning on a common standard for how to exchange that data would be, I'll use the term, right, it would be a no-brainer, right? Like that shouldn't even be up for debates. If we were to start today and say, look, if we need to design a capability to support serialization traceability, one of the foundational aspects of that capability has to be that we just all need to agree upon how we're going to exchange data with each other. What we all then do with the data after we receive it, that's entirely up to us to figure out, right? And to provide the best capability and features, right, to ultimately deliver the value to our customers. But just how the data goes between each of us, right, that should be on the same level as how the internet works, right? If I open up a browser and I type in a web address, I know that I'm going to get to that website because the internet is strictly adhering to standards. That if it didn't adhere to those standards, my browser wouldn't get to the website. And that would never be, an acceptable situation from a user perspective. What's interesting is that's not the path that pharma serialization largely followed, right? There wasn't sort of this no-brainer, okay, let's just all agree that this is the single standard we should all align on. Many in the industry did come to that, I think, no-brainer conclusion. But as you highlight, right, there are certain actors that decided not to necessarily strictly follow the EPCIS standard, but instead implement their own proprietary formats. And so what I always come back to in that situation is I always ask myself, why would somebody do that? Right, Justin? Like why would a solution provider decide if there's a standard available, why would I choose not to necessarily follow that standard? Or even if it's not that I'm choosing not to follow the standard, but in addition to that standard, I'm also going to introduce my own proprietary formats, right? And this is kind of the leading question I was mentioning. What would be the motivation or the justification to make that kind of decision?
I would say that there's a certain element of competitive advantage in there. Each provider within a market is trying to gain or retain as much of the market for their products as they've already achieved, and in making those changes and becoming perhaps less compliant with the standard, they would see that they can perhaps garner more of the market, and also retain that market by preventing others from entering that sector of the market. But in terms of the way that the US market works, from what we've spoken about, Scott, that doesn't work, because that means that effectively every vendor is going to have to create a special solution for each vendor that creates their own special solution. And every time a vendor creates another solution, it costs them money. And what happens to that cost? They don't bear that cost themselves. They pass that on to the manufacturers. So that just pushes the costs up for the whole supply chain. If the information that's being passed between the partners is difficult to pass or inconsistent, what happens when you do get a potential falsification within the system, and the regulator, in the case of the USA, asks for the manufacturer to go down the supply chain and collect all the data? The understanding of the regulation is you have 3 working days to collect that data and present it back to the regulator. Now, having actually worked on some falsification requests that have come from the UK regulator when I was the General Manager of Securement, I can tell you that we were able to pass back the data within half to 1 day. And it would only be more than 1 day if we had to contact some of our colleagues from the other countries to go and get data from them. But we could present all the data back in a well-structured format for a potential falsification within one working day. Now, we didn't have any problems with going and getting the data because we had all the data within the system, within the reporting system. And that was it. And we have multiple sets of data that we could collate together to create the right picture. That's what you need. The regulator needs to be able to stop the supply of fake medicines into the supply chain very quickly if you do get a potential falsification. That's not possible if you're going to have problems with that, with the different formats of data and putting all that data together.
And you've hit such an important point right on the head, right? Which I think goes back to one of those overarching themes that we want to certainly ensure is a takeaway from this session, right? Is where are those risks and inherently higher costs that come into play when you're implementing solutions that don't follow the standards from start to finish. So let's take real quickly, right? Let's take a very real example, which is kind of exactly along the use case that you were raising, Jerome. So if I'm now the FDA and I now need to be involved in an investigation into a particular product or whatever it may be, a set of products, from a DSCSA standpoint, there is the requirement as defined by DSCSA to exchange, very specific data elements every time that product changes hands. Which is all well and good, right? And again, EPCIS very much comes into play with those data exchanges, right? These would be what's usually referred to as the T2 exchanges. What I'm not sure has been fully appreciated by both the industry and, quite honestly, potentially by the FDA, although I'm going to give the FDA the benefit of the doubt on this one, is, well, when you get into the situation of investigation, it's almost a guarantee that you're going to have to rely upon data that goes well beyond what's contained in these transactional or T2 exchanges that occur just when the product is sold. Realistically, I would need to go back and want to see the detailed data about potentially when, where that item was actually packaged, which I get some reference to that in my T2, although I can tell you just from experience, probably 90+% of the time, the specific details contained in a T2 file that is supposed to tell me when and where an item was commissioned is not actually accurate. Again, probably over 90% of the time, meaning it probably reflects a different location or it doesn't reflect the exact time that a particular item was commissioned. And the reason for that is because the DSCSA regulation as a whole allows for that. Right? The DSCSA doesn't say, oh, you absolutely have to have the exact right time down to the millisecond, right? And in fact, there's even more flexibility given to how you can report where a particular event occurred. So DSCSA has kind of allowed for some flexibility in the data that's being exchanged. But when you come again to this point of now I actually have to be able to use this data because I have an investigation ongoing into a potentially suspect or illegitimate product. What I don't think the FDA potentially, nor largely the industry truly understands, is that outside of those T2 files, which hopefully are in EPCIS format, there's a good segment of the industry that the rest of their serialization data has never existed in an EPCIS format, right? Because this goes back to the earlier point. The amount of companies leveraging solutions who quite honestly don't even know that their packaging data, potentially their distribution data, is following a proprietary standard and not following the EPCIS standard is significantly higher than you probably would want to believe it is, right? That can't tell you the amount of times I've had conversations with manufacturers in the US and I would have to be the one to tell them, hey, do you guys know that you're not even using EPCIS in your data exchanges with your packaging sites, or your CMOs, or with your 3PLs, right? Like you're not using EPCIS for any of these. And that's going to really start to, not that it hasn't already, but it's really going to start to use the cliche, rear its ugly head, because the expectation that you're going to now be able to easily access and quickly and efficiently process traceability data down to the granular level, which could be very, very critical in the case of a product investigation into a potentially suspect or illegitimate product, is going to literally be non-existent for so many companies because they won't be able to produce EPCIS data for potentially a majority of the products that they've been packaged. So that's going to cause them challenges. That's also going to cause the FDA challenges because they're going to now have to be able to account for, well, sometimes I might be given data in EPCIS format, but then other times, if I have to look a little bit deeper, I'm not going to get data in EPCIS format. Is the FDA now going to want to have to go off and build its capabilities around different data standards? I think the expectation is they're going to assume, oh, if I need to investigate and rely upon traceability data, I'm always going to be able to get that data in EPCIS format. And that's just simply not the reality for a pretty good segment of the industry, right? And that's going to cause challenges, again, for those companies, but also for the FDA to be efficient in those investigations, which is critical because now you're talking about patient safety, and potentially lives on the line.
Jerome, you mentioned competitiveness, and you're right. Every vendor wants an edge, undeniably. But there's a line where competitive design becomes counterproductive to the ecosystem. And even anti-competitive in some respects, especially when it seeks a monopoly. But if each solution deviates from the standard, interoperability fragments, right? And the entire supply chain pays the price in integration costs, exception handling, investigation delays. Compliance wasn't something business chose, right? It was bestowed through regulation. So within that obligation lies an opportunity. Follow the standards properly and you gain reliability, visibility and trust, or ignore them and you inherit endless rework, false alerts and spiraling support costs.
Yeah, one of the challenges in this is we live in countries and pretty much most countries around the world where competition, markets and competition is just the way of doing business. And in actual fact, in this of compliance area, which is what serialization is making sure that your products are compliant with a standard, that you can perform data interchange to a standard, and also that you can build up the audit trail, the traceability, so in the event of a problem, you can actually get to the root of the problem quite quickly. That requires people to cooperate with each other. And there is this term that's used in some markets called co-opetition, where players in the market actually will cooperate with each other to actually for the benefit of all. But actual fact, no, it still allows competition to occur, but allows people to cooperate. And that then enables some of those other benefits to be achieved and helps lower the costs for everyone in terms of complying, in this case, with the serialization or traceability regulations.
Yeah, probably one of my favorite terms, to be honest. And I'm so happy that you raised that, Jerome, right? That term to me is maybe the best descriptor of where I think in many aspects, the kind of pharma serialization has kind of gotten off the track that it really should be on, right? Because I think we got away from that exact concept or that way of thinking, and I think part of that is also highlighting, kind of taking it back to one of the earlier points, right? We've talked about there's clearly a responsibility on solution providers because they are the ones who directly implement and are the ones that you look to be taking on responsibility to adhere to standards. But you can't say that there is no responsibility, right, on the industry itself, especially in the US, where we are effectively left to kind of police ourselves, right? Again, we don't have that central system to sort of systematically enforce that strict adherence to standards is being followed. So we're really left to kind of enforce ourselves. And that falls back on the industry. You hope you can rely on your vendors and solution providers to sort of do that on your behalf. But it can never go to zero responsibility for the entities within the industry itself. And I think that's really one of the, that would be a key action item and takeaway from this session and from this discussion on this topic, right? Is I would absolutely encourage users to really go back and just do a review, right, of your current capabilities, but at a very detailed level, maybe more detailed than they've ever done in the past, to truly confirm that standards are being followed correctly and even just being used, period, right, across all of your key data exchanges. Like I said, there are so many companies that I've had to be the one to tell them in situations where they're not even following or using EPCIS in any way, shape, or form, and that's a surprise to them, right? Now, the key also is to make sure it's clear, again, of what those risks and ultimately the potential impact on bottom line is, right? When you identify these situations where standards aren't being followed, or maybe loosely followed, but not in a sort of strict adherent way. Had an experience shared with me literally 3 days ago from a colleague in the serialization space, right? In speaking with a VP of supply chain at a small biotech, was having challenges with their data exchange with trading partners, had to dig in, actually open up the data files themselves, had to actually look at specific values within the data files. And what they identified, right, is the fact that the root cause of challenges they were having is because of the way that certain values were having to be mapped from one format, non-standard format, into the EPCIS format, right? Exactly what Justin was referring to earlier. So you have very real world examples, right, where the fact that these standards, again, either aren't being used or are not strictly being followed, they will lead to failures. Those failures will cost customers, be it manufacturers, wholesalers, whoever, will cost them more money, and not just, minimal amounts of money. You're potentially talking about very, very significant amounts of money when we start getting into potential costs of product disruptions, shipments being returned, whatever it may be. Like, those kinds of situations are happening, and the root causes are being identified as, well, I had this value that was in a different format that I had to map into my EPCIS in a slightly different format, and that mapping failed. Therefore, my entire T2 failed. I mean, those types of things, again, if we bring it back to the internet and how the internet works, those types of things just simply can't happen because it's such a strict adherence and a strict enforcement of those standards being followed, right? You always expect to get to a website when you open a browser. Like Justin said, you always expect when you dial a phone number, you're going to get the recipient on the other end. Part of what the industry needs to evolve and kind of understand is that's the level of expectation that we should be setting for interoperability within the serialization world. Interoperability, the ability to send data from my system to your system, is not the value driver in all of this, right? That it is the commodity in all of this. The value drivers come on top of those layers of interoperability, right? The value drivers are, do I get good support? Do I have good reporting? Do my systems allow me to manage my operations on a daily basis in an efficient way that doesn't require me to hire 5 people from the outside to manage my DSCSA or my serialization operations? It's going to take time, right? The problem is the industry has not correctly put value on those areas which are the actual value drivers. Too much historically, the value has been put on, can I connect to my trading partners? And again, that should be the commodity, right? That is not the value driver. The value driver needs to be what you can do with the data after, right, the interoperability does its job. And so that's what I would just certainly recommend to listeners as a takeaway and as an action from this session. Do that kind of review of your current capabilities. Really try to dig in and see if, again, not only are standards being leveraged at all, but are they correctly being leveraged? Because like I said, I think a lot of people would be in for some surprises when they do that kind of review.
Yep. Accountability has two sides, the enforcers and the enforced. Yes, solution providers must align more closely to the standards they claim to support, but users, the license holders, the manufacturers, the distributors also have to verify that alignment across both technology and business operations. Too often, businesses look outward to vendors and consultants for assurance, right? Instead of inward for evidence of their own must-have requirements. If you own the data, you own the responsibility to ensure your partners and suppliers are conformant. That's how you control cost and risk. It's not about blame. It's about understanding what truly serves the business and what doesn't. A brand label just doesn't cut the mustard. You need verifiable competency, and that's what's really required. A standard only works when everyone in the chain plays their part with integrity.
And important to highlight, Justin, that I think we can say across all three of us, myself, yourself, and Jerome, we are all three consultants, right? Who I think would still support this point that, in fact, because we've seen it through experience, right, that you can implement capabilities that follow standards strictly, and that can lead to direct correlations into, right, the efficiency in which you can manage your ongoing operations to the point where, as I said before, you shouldn't even need potentially, right, to have to hire. Not saying you may not have to hire at all, but certainly not as many. I think that compared to what we do see, a lot of companies having to go out and hire, right, to just manage their serialization operations, and what's probably unknown, because it's being viewed at just strictly a business level, to your point, right? What is probably unknown is so many of the reasons that they require to have that high level of resource to sort of handhold their operations, right? Resolve exceptions, make sure systems are operating like they're supposed to, make sure data exchanges are operating like they're supposed to. So many of the root causes likely can be tied back to, again, either the non-use of standards or the sort of, let's call it, loose or incorrect implementation of those standards, right? That's probably the most direct correlation we can really drive, if you will, is the fact that, right, so many businesses could recognize significant cost savings. And again, we're saying this as consultants ourselves. They could realize such significant cost savings just by simply reviewing, again, the adherence of their current capabilities to strictly following standards. Key point.
And it might also be, might also consider now that if you don't have the information, not doing the information, not managing your data in the most efficient manner, one is costing your business in terms of the time and effort. But if you then get a regulatory inspection or a periodic regulatory inspection, and the data's not correct, or you can't show it's correct, then you're going to get a number of observations, and there's going to be a whole load of new work to do to meet the requirements of the regulator to show you're complying with the regulation based on the output of that inspection. So there is not having the data correctly managed, or not have the correct data interchange, not having that tested through, will ultimately cost your business. It may seem like you can operate the business with inconsistent data, but as soon as you get into this regulatory or enforcement aspect from external inspectors, from perhaps the regulator, the medicines regulator, then it can actually cost your business a quite significant amount of money more too.
And I'll close it out, at least from my part, with a comment that I know I've made in past discussions and posts, but I think it's just such a critical point to raise, which is to say that, as a consultant, so often, and I'll kind of bring this back to how it ties back to standards, but as a consultant, so often, if I'm meeting with, let's say, a manufacturer who maybe is at the very start of their serialization journey, right? 99% of the time, 100% of the time, that manufacturer is going to ask me, hey, Scott, who do most of your, clients, what vendor do they use? And anytime I get asked that question, I immediately go back to them and then say, that's not the right question to ask, right? You shouldn't be asking me what vendor most of my current clients use. You should be asking me what vendor are used by the clients who no longer need my support, right? Because that's what you want to be ultimately in whatever it is, 6 months, 12 months, a year from now. You want to be in that category of companies who don't need my support any longer because you're able to do everything yourself, right? And because I'll tell them it's two very different answers. If I tell you the vendor who most of my current clients use, it's because those clients still need my help on an ongoing basis. And that's not going to be the position I want, my new clients to be in 12 months from now. So I always make sure to kind of correct them from the start, right? To say, you don't want to know who my current clients use. You want to know the vendors that my past clients who don't need me anymore. That's the vendors, right? That you want to be looking at. That's a key shift. And I think it's important because it highlights the fact that most often the reason I have to continue to support clients of mine, typically manufacturers or wholesalers, the reason I have to keep supporting them oftentimes is to help resolve ongoing issues related somehow to, again, the non-use of standards or incorrect adherence to those standards, right? If I really drill down the root causes of what I probably am supporting on a day-to-day basis for my clients who need me to continue to support them going forward, it absolutely comes down to some sort of non-adherence to standards. So again, I think just a key takeaway for listeners to sort of consider with their current capabilities, right? It's not about who continues to, who requires you to keep having ongoing support. You should be looking for those situations that allow you to be able to manage, your daily operations on your own, because it is 100% possible to do. And companies, I'm not going to say, J&J and Teva, right, are going to potentially be able to get away from outside support, but small, medium manufacturers absolutely have plenty of use cases that we can show, don't need constant ongoing consulting support and are, very compliant and operate very efficiently on a daily basis.
And ultimately, that's the true measure of digital transformation, right? Automation, efficiency, insight. It's not just the large enterprises that benefit from serialization, but the majority of the pharma economy of small and medium businesses. And you make an excellent point, Scott, that it's the vendors that don't require support where you want to focus your selection process. When your data standards are implemented correctly, you don't need armies of consultants or endless exception reviews. Serialization is not just about compliance, but attempting to gain an advantage over having transparency and control of your data without ludicrous costs and complicated technology which only vendors and consultants understand.
And I think from the European perspective, I was just thinking, reflecting on what Scott said there. In the UK, when we had a medicines verification system, we had approximately 650 marketing authorization holders. I think there's about 25,000 different SKUs across them, and about just under 2 billion packs of medicines loaded into the system per year. We consistently had only about 20 to 25 that needed help with the data uploads or making sure the data was coming in consistently on a regular basis. So less than 5% of the manufacturers in the UK, with these strong data standards in Europe and the strong data standards for upload and the consistency of data upload, we only about less than 5% really needed any encouragement to be compliant with what was going on within Europe. And that actually meant that our data quality of the data within the system was actually very good. It meant as the data was scanned, the packs were there to be scanned, and also, of course, when we needed to access the audit trail, the data was there of what had happened to the audit trail, which helped the regulators do their job too.
And so, as we close this episode of Decommissioned, it's worth remembering that a standard is more than a document. It's a shared promise. When we follow it faithfully, data flows freely, trust compounds, and compliance becomes almost effortless. But when a vendor deviates, we pay the price in noise, in cost, and in confusion. The standard isn't broken, the implementation is. Thanks to our hosts, Jerome Bertin and Scott Pugh. Until next time, I'm Justin Ahdan. Stay curious, stay compliant, and above all, stay standard. Until the next episode of Decommissioned, goodbye.